As you can see, we have Michael with us again. So this is your opportunity to ask many, many more questions. Um, this particular session is designed to go deeper into issues around the complexity and evaluation under real world constraints. So welcome to joining us here in this seminar. Michael has just spoken, so I don't think I need to introduce him. He's done a lot of work on complexity in various contexts. And then with me, I have also Ricardo Wilson Gray, right to my hand side. He is an evaluator who works globally, works with NGOs, foundations, governments, to undertake evaluations, to advise them on evaluations, and has come across complexity in a lot of his work, and wants to share and will share with us his ideas of how to manage evaluations in those contexts. And then the third panelist to the far right from me is Jos Wassens. Jos has a distinguished career both in academia and evaluation. He works with me in the independent evaluation group at the World Bank Group and helps us sort of integrate more sophisticated methodologies into our major evaluations. Before joining us, he worked at UNESCO in the evaluation office, and before that in the bilateral system. He is one of the three co-authors of the book Complexity and Evaluation, which is highly recommendable. So what we're going to do today is unpack a little bit more what does complexity really mean in evaluations that we do in a day-to-day basis. And Michael has set really a great foundation to unpack what does complexity mean and what are some of the challenges that arise for our evaluations, and how does that affect the validity of what we find, and how we can use that data in order to give the best possible advice to policymakers, program implementers, and the broad public in terms of what has been achieved and what has not been achieved. So what is complexity and why is it so important at this moment in time? We have, well, maybe we have realized that complexity is with us. When you think back, our world, whether it's economics or otherwise, has had a tendency to simplify things. Economic theories are brought down to very simple theories with assumptions so that the theory can work. And when we think of us as evaluators, that got translated into log frames, logical models, results chains that are fairly linear, that sort of assume you do have an input that finances an activity, that produces an output, and that generates an outcome at intermediate level or immediate level, and then eventually impacts, and there is somehow sustainability that arises from all of this, right? So in today's world, we know that it is not as simple as that. Things are not as linear as that. When we undertake an intervention at one point in an ecosystem, in a system of a social system where people live and act and react, they might not react exactly in the way we anticipated along these very linear logical framework models. So this has become so pronounced, especially in a world that is far more interconnected than it ever has been, whether it is virtually through the internet, where we know here in Istanbul what is happening simultaneously anywhere else in the world, or where we can communicate and network with large groups of people anywhere in this universe. And then we have the actual travel. There are many more people who are traveling around the world and connecting face-to-face, connecting cultures, but also then carrying with them, I mean, there is a big issue around epidemics and diseases. There is a strong interrelationship economically when we think of the 2008 economic crisis, which rippled out from the US and affected the world, right? So there are these interconnectedness that we recognize today and that we need to account for as we are designing interventions, but also as we are evaluating them. And this has become captured in the SDGs that are, yes, you can argue there are 17 single goals. Each of them have targets. But when you really analyze them, when you read them, you will see that they are interrelated. Some of them help and facilitate and amplify the achievement of others. And there are some that actually will be in tension, in competition with each other, where you have to make trade-off decisions. If I want X, can I really pursue Y as well? And how to manage those interrelationships. So if anything, going forward towards 2030, we will see more complexity rather than less complexity. And that is something where we evaluators have to up our game and think about how do we build that into our evaluation methodologies. And that is the subject of our discussion today. So in the first round, I'm going to ask each of the speakers to give us their lightning talk, about 5 minutes, about what do you consider the most important conceptual and methodological challenge for evaluation in terms of dealing with complexity? What are potentially helpful solutions? So challenges and solutions.
Good morning, everybody. It's really a pleasure to be here. I was just looking at my notes, and they look like the design of a complex intervention are completely indecipherable. So I'll just talk from here. So there is no clear definition, or let's say there's no common definition of complexity. And there's certainly no common definition of complexity in the field of evaluation. Broadly, it refers to, let's say, learning from and applying concepts, ideas, methods from complexity science and systems thinking. And of course, we have to do that in a very practical way, because evaluation is not just applied policy-oriented research, but is applied policy-oriented research on the time, data, political and resource constraints. So let me bring up two important challenges, which in some ways have already been reflected by the seminal presentation of Michael, but let me try to bring them more to a general level and provide some examples. So my first major issue that I would like to bring to your attention is the idea that interventions operate in systems. And let's reflect a little bit on the practice of evaluation. Evaluation is really about analyzing the relevance, effectiveness, etc. of interventions. By evaluating, we look at reality through the lens of the intervention. So this is an intervention-centric approach. And you may not realize it, by doing so, we are kind of running the risk that we are overestimating what the intervention does and underestimating the context, the reality in which interventions operate. So we have to be consciously aware of that. So how do we deal with that? Well, one way is to be continuously aware of this and reflect on it. We have to develop a good theories of change on how our intervention is embedded in complex realities. What are the contextual factors that influence interventions? However, the theories can also be cognitive traps. There is not just one theory of change. Ideally, we want to develop multiple theories of change and maybe even adjudicate between theories to our hands understanding of the world. One other way of looking at interventions is to step away from this intervention-centric perspective, this theory of change perspective, which also is intervention-centric, but take a systems perspective. Try to capture the reality in which interventions are embedded. And rather taking the intervention as the starting point, take the system as the starting point. So systems approaches can help us do that. And one example is a systems map, where you draw, for example, the major drivers of change in the local or regional economy, what are the main actors, what are the main processes of change, and in that you try to situate an intervention. By doing that, you immediately start reasoning how this intervention influences process of change, taking really due account of other factors. It changes your mindset, but it also has implications for data. So systems maps and system dynamics, which is a simulation technique which helps to look at the dynamics of the system, can be helpful here. Another example, which looks at the system's perspective from a relational point of view, from a stakeholder point of view, is social network analysis. So instead of, if I want to understand the strategic positioning or the role of the World Bank Group in a particular sector in a particular country, I can ask questions about the World Bank Group to different stakeholders and develop my perspective, my triangulated perspective. A different way of doing it would be actually to map the whole institutional landscape in a particular sector and look at the interactions between the actors. And social network analysis helps us doing that. We did that, for example, this year in Liberia, where we looked at the positioning of the bank in the health sector. We looked at how financial flows were going between more than 50 actors supporting the health sector. We looked at dimensions such as knowledge leadership. And actually it was quite surprising because on the one hand it provided some clarity on ideas that we also knew from other methods on the positioning of the bank as a financier of the government budget, but gave much more detailed information about that because it also mapped financial flows between other organizations. But it really tested some of our ideas as to the role of the bank as a knowledge leader, for example, in the field of health, where the bank was not a leader but situated in the let's say the third tier of organizations as a technical knowledge leader in that field. So it really helped us to reframe our perceptions and our ideas about how an organization positions itself. So systems perspective can be very important in changing our perspective from an intervention-centric look to a more, let's say, less biased systems look at how change occurs. And this also very closely relates to the idea that Michael brought up, this idea of looking more at the causes of effects rather than the effects of causes being an intervention. I hope I have 2 minutes left. Yeah. So the second idea that I would briefly would like to bring to your attention is, apart from interventions in a system, another major challenge is the intervention as a system. An intervention itself can be perceived as a complex system. Interventions are about resources, activities, stakeholders, which can lead to very, very complex causal pathways, as Michael showed. But to even complicate things further, we as evaluators are not only interested in very simple projects, but the whole aid architecture, the development architecture, but also national governments are moving evaluators to look at interventions at much higher levels, at the level of country programs, regional strategies, thematic programs, which adds a lot more diversity to what we need to evaluate. So in practice, evaluators are confronted with multi-level, multi-site, multi-activity, multi-stakeholder evaluants. And this is a very, very daunting challenge to look at as an evaluator. So how do we go about designing an evaluation in such a daunting, with such a daunting evaluant? Now this is a conversation of 5.7 hours. So let me summarize it in 1 minute. You have to think about questions at the level of the overall evaluant. You can think about questions of overall positioning, strategic alignment, policy coherence, but you also have to be very focused and selective on how you are going to look at particular elements of this evaluant, particular levels of analysis, particular intervention activities. Think about sampling strategies, think about particular methods that you are going to use to collect data at these specific activity levels, and think about methods and synthesize or to some extent generalize these findings to the higher level of the evaluant. This is a very daunting challenge, and I think it's to a large extent much more of an art than a science.
Elaborate and refine two different things. One is to explain why I think development keeps getting harder, why this complexity challenge is not just with us, but is going to keep getting harder the more we actually succeed in doing everything else that we do. And I'm going to answer that sort of in two ways. One, just by looking at the way in which problems evolve generally, and then looking at the history of the administrative tools that we have and why we're stuck, as it were, with a particular way of assessing ourselves that was born of a different era. So the first thing is, why do things get more complicated? If you try to run a marathon, for example, right, the first 20 miles is usually okay. Most people can run that first 20 miles. The hardest part of the marathon is the last 6. Right? If you're learning a foreign language, you can learn to say please, thank you, hello, goodbye. You can get by with a language pretty quickly, but to be able to actually do it well, to speak it and to write poetry, the hardest part is that bit, right? In English, we call this the 80-20 rule. It means that to be 80% good at something, it takes the first 20% of your time and effort. To get the last 20% really good, that takes 80% of your time and effort. And that's true, I think, in language, it's true in sports, it's true in your professional activities. Most of them follow that same kind of logic. Pareto, who's otherwise famous in economics for other stuff, was the first to sort of try and explore the implications of that. But if we take that as a general rule and apply that to development, I think you can, and I saw this when I worked in Malaysia, that you can pave all the roads, you can have a well-insulated technocratic class that can run the trade balances and the macroeconomy pretty well. You can have smart people sort of who are able to be insulated enough, protected from political forces such that they can get your country pretty much into middle income status. If you can do the routine, the technical tasks and the logistical tasks pretty well, you can get yourself pretty far way down the development journey. But as I said with regards to the Sustainable Development Goals, the reason they're so much more expansive and so much more complicated than the Millennium Development Goals before them is in some sense a product of success. We've done the thing, we figured out how to build schools, we figured out how to get kids to come to school. We know how to do those things now. But that just raises the bar, right? That just makes things more and more difficult. So we have to figure out how to educate kids. We have to recognize that people now live 20 years longer than they did. So a healthcare system designed for when people live to be 45 is really different from a healthcare system that's designed to deal with people that live to 65. Right? Entirely different diseases that people get when they're at 65. So you have to have a whole different healthcare system to deal with that. You have to have pensions. You have to have regulatory powers. You have to have a whole bunch of different things that are a function of succeeding in development. So those challenges just keep getting harder. And if you apply the 80-20 rule to individual projects as well as to countries, you see that I think the challenges just keep getting harder, and they take more and more time to achieve obvious gains that are so much harder to actually observe. It's a curve that sort of gets flatter and flatter the further out you go. But the challenges of and the accomplishments that those systems are asked to do is correspondingly higher. Now, we now manage all of those things still with more or less the same kinds of administrative systems that we've had forever. The whole idea of a log frame, for example, that comes out of the mid-1950s and 60s. It was a whole system designed at a particular period in time when planning in the capital P sense was the way in which the world was operated and managed. And if the challenges just keep getting bigger, but we don't update our administrative systems, then we're in a world that I sometimes describe as trying to run Firefox on DOS, right? It's trying to use open source software on an administrative infrastructure that was built 30 or 40 or 50 years ago, and that was great at the time and reflected the sensibilities of a particular time, but it isn't actually able to do the kind of work we now need it to do. Right? So our computers keep crashing, in other words, because we're trying to run very fancy software on an operating system that's very clunky. And trying to think that if we only had more fancy software that we would figure this all out. the system's going to keep crashing unless we have a very different operating system that we can design. And our grandparents figured out how to design log frames. Our grandparents figured out how to build big bureaucratic systems to keep the world from blowing itself up. Our grandparents built most of the major modern administrative systems that we are beneficiaries of. But the challenge in the 21st century is to respond to our 21st century challenges with 21st century sensibilities and 21st century technologies. And we have to show the same creativity and the same commitments that our grandparents did. And we see some of that when you see the wonders of astrophysics that I just described in my presentation, but we seem very uncreative, it seems to me, in how we go about upgrading the operating system that drives most of our organizational systems around the world. At the World Bank, we are trying to fix some of those things now with new initiatives that are coming up. We have an Agile Fellows program that we for a group of people to think very creatively about some alternative to long frames that still keeps us accountable, that still is able to track money and procurement systems throughout our organization, but nonetheless builds in the space for the experimentation, the flexibility, the iteration that we so desperately need if we're going to address these kinds of challenges. So I think the challenge isn't just to evaluate within the existing system, is to have a better piece of software that we can design to do this. The bigger challenge for all of us is how we design a different operating system so that our programs don't keep crashing.
My attempt to answer the first question based on my own experience in evaluation in complex situations. The experience is based on primarily the evaluation of projects and programs of international development funders, as you can see here. It includes the World Bank and the United Nations Trust Fund and Violence Against Women, but then a number of outputs, and have we been effective in terms of achieving our outputs and our outcomes and our impact. And the kinds of programs that face simple challenges, which doesn't mean they're easy, but they're simple in the sense that you know the relationships of cause and effect, are annual vaccination campaigns, building roads, teaching adult literacy, constructing schools. For all of these, there's proven ways of doing it, models, there's a lot of experience, best practices, and so forth. And so what you have to do is simply get on to doing it and then evaluate it conventionally. All of these programs that I work with to evaluate did not face a situation. As I said, that we don't have an original plan for you to go out and evaluate. But we've been doing a lot of work and spending a lot of money. We want to know what we've achieved. And we realized that what they faced was a complex situation. They were on the same shore. They knew what their goal was, the island's out there someplace. But they really found it very difficult to predetermine or foresee how to get there. Was it best to swim? Was it best to row a boat? Was it best to take a motorboat? And ended up basically trying out the different methods. So they jump in the water and try and swim. If that didn't work, they'd come back and then they look for a rowboat or a motorboat.